They locked the reliquary to preserve what remained of Saint Bartholomew, but no candle is burned there longer than a breath. Every flame extinguishes, every prayer is silenced, and those who kept watch claim the darkness inside breathes back. The camera moves slowly, as if through corridors of stone. The sound is muted heavy, as though pressed under centuries of silence. Dust hangs like faint smoke in the shafts of light that pierce narrow windows. This is where it began. Beneath a cloister stone, under the chanting of monks and the solemn bells of evening mass, there was a chamber that few would ever see. It was not grand, not adorned with riches or gilded walls. It was small, narrow, a room carved from earth itself, where the air always felt damp and close. And in its center rested a box, a reliquary. It was built for a single purpose, to contain what remained of a man who was not supposed to be forgotten, Saint Bartholomew. He was remembered as one of the 12, an apostle who had carried the words of Christ into lands that had not wanted them, an apostle who had been torn apart for his devotion, flayed alive, left to die in agony, yet unyielding in his faith. His suffering became a symbol. His bones, fragments of his body, became relics. And those relics, they were sealed in this place. The church called an honor, a sanctuary of holiness, a vessel of grace. But what was preserved beneath those stones was something else. Monks who first stood guard over the reliquary described a feeling they could never explain. They would descend the spiral staircase, holding a lantern, their robes brushing against cold walls slick with condensation. And as they drew closer to the chamber door, they said the air itself grew heavier, thicker, as if it was no longer meant to be breathed. They whispered to one another later that the silence there had weight, that it pressed against the skin, that it swallowed even the sound of their footsteps. And when they entered, the sensation only deepened. The reliquary itself was simple, a heavy chest of carved wood, reinforced with iron bands, resting on a stone pedestal. No decorations, no gold leaf, no jeweled ornamentation to catch the eye of pilgrims. It was, as records describe it, almost austere, and yet no one could look at it for long. Every account describes the same thing, that the reliquary seemed darker than the rest of the room, even in lamplight, that its shape was indistinct, as though the edges blurred, that men who stared at it too long felt their eyes water and their heads grow light. But these were men of devotion. They accepted what they felt as part of their duty, a test of obedience. And so the reliquary was locked. Only priests appointed by Rome could approach it. No pilgrim ever laid eyes on it. No lay brother entered the chamber. The bones of Bartholomew were not for the faithful to touch. They were for the church alone to guard. Still, the stories bled outward. Visitors to the cloister were told in hushed tones about the relic below. They heard whispers of miracles, though none could be confirmed. They were told that prayers answered in the chapel above were owed to the presence of the apostles' remains. Mothers brought sick children. Soldiers came before battle. Merchants before dangerous journeys. The reliquary became a name, a shadow, a rumor, but something wasn't right. The earliest written account comes from a monk named Brother Elias. His journal survives in fragments, preserved by accident in the cloister's archives. In it, he describes his first night on watch. He writes of kneeling before the reliquary, of whispering prayers in Latin, of the flame of his candle trembling in the stillness of the chamber. And then he writes, without wind or draft, without movement of air at all. The candle went out. He thought at first he had fallen asleep, that his hand had tipped the flame too close to the wax. But when he struck flint again, the wick caught, only to die once more almost immediately. He tried a third time, a fourth, and always the same. The flame rose, wavered, and vanished. Elias wrote that he felt the darkness close in, that he could hear the faintest suggestion of something like breathing. Not his own, but another's, in rhythm with a heartbeat. He fled the chamber, ashamed of his fear. When he confessed it the next morning, the abbot rebuked him. Fear, he was told, was weakness. If the candle did not burn, it was his fault, his doubt, his lack of faith. But Elias knew. He knew what he had felt, and he was not alone. Years later, another account emerges. This one from Abbot Clement himself. He records, reluctantly, the testimony of two monks who swore that their lanterns failed the moment they stepped into the chamber. Both described the same impression, as though fingers had pinched the flame from existence, as though someone unseen had leaned close and breathed upon it. It became known as the first sign. The reliquary of Saint Bartholomew would not allow a candle to burn, yet, instead of doubting, the church leaned into its mystery. It was proclaimed a test of purity, that only the light of heaven could endure in the presence of the holy, that the failure of candles was not a curse, but a mark of sanctity. But the monks who kept watch knew differently. They saw how their hands trembled when they held a flame to the wick, how the spark refused catch, how the air grew colder the longer they stayed. They began to fear the chamber, and still they returned, because silence was their vow, because obedience was their salvation, because to disobey meant exile, disgrace, damnation. So they descended again and again, carrying candles they knew would not survive. The reliquary did not move. It did not speak. It did not reveal itself. And yet it ruled them. One monk, Brother Julian, described it best. He wrote that the reliquary was a mouth that did not open and yet consumed. Another, Brother Matthias, confessed privately that he had begun to dream of it, that in his sleep he saw a great black box bound in, iron but pulsing faintly as if with breath, that he would wake with the taste of tallow in his mouth. And still the bones remained locked inside. The church recorded the reliquary as a triumph, a holy artifact, a victory of preservation. But those who stood before it night after night began to change. They grew pale. Their voices trembled in song. They flinched at shadows. And when asked, they would not speak of what they felt, because to speak of it was to admit the truth, that what lay inside was not at peace, that the bones of a martyr were not silent. And though the centuries have passed, though the cloister has crumbled, though the reliquary itself remains hidden beneath layers of dust and stone, the first chapter of its story is always the same. It was built to honor. It was locked to protect. But from the very beginning, the reliquary refused to be holy, and every flame that dared to shine upon it was devoured. The stone corridor narrows. The walls are close, damp with moisture, and the sound of sandals against the flagstones echoes like distant thunder. A faint glow trembles in the monk's hand, a fragile flame carried down into the earth. The first candle. It was meant to be simple, a light to keep watch, a flame to hold back the dark. Yet even here, among prayers and stone, fire refused to live. The monks had taken their duty with solemnity. They had been told the chamber beneath the cloister was holy, that within it lay the bones of one who had suffered for the church, that silence and obedience were their task. And so they carried their candles. The descent was slow. The spiral stairs curved tighter the deeper they went, until the air itself changed. Thicker, clammy, the wax softened in their hands before the flame ever touched it. And when the door opened, the chamber seemed to sigh. No draft, no gust of air, just a sound, low, heavy, as though the walls themselves exhaled. But something wasn't right. The first monk, Brother Severin, struck flint against steel. Sparks caught. The wick flared, bloomed into yellow light. For a moment the chamber came alive. Iron bands across the reliquary glimmered. Damp stone shone slick. Shadows stretched away into corners. And then the flame vanished. Pinched. That was the word Severin wrote later. Not blown out. Not suffocated. Pinched, as though invisible fingers had closed around it. He tried again. Another strike. The candle caught. He held it close, sheltering it from air. The flame burned steady for a breath. 2 breaths. And then it was gone. Severin's hands shook. Wax dripped hot against the skin. The candle stubbed itself into blackness. And that's when he heard it. A sound like shifting fabric. A faint scrape, as though something moved along the walls. He froze, held his breath, listened, but the chamber gave him nothing. When he emerged, pale and trembling, the others saw his fear. They mocked him, gently at first, then with growing unease. But when they too descended, they learned the same truth. Every candle failed. It became a ritual of humiliation. One by one, brothers descended into the dark, clutching candles they knew would not burn. They lit them, They prayed over them. They whispered blessings. And still always the same. The flame rose, wavered, then died. They began to describe the extinguishing in the same way. Pinched, not blown, not flickering to nothing, but stolen, taken deliberately. And soon, other details crept into their testimony. Brother Hadrian wrote that when the flame died, the walls seemed to shift closer, that shadows lengthened unnaturally, stretching toward him, curling across the floor. Brother Elias confessed that the darkness seemed to press against his face, warm and damp, like breath exhaled directly onto his skin. Others spoke of hearing a sound, faint, rhythmic, not the echo of their own pulse, but something heavier, slower, a second heartbeat. And though no word was spoken aloud, every man carried the same suspicion back to the cloister above, that the reliquary did not want light. At first, the abbot dismissed their fears. He insisted that doubt corrupted their senses. That fear bred delusion. He told them that holiness resided in darkness, that saints required faith, not fire. But doubt spread. A test was arranged. 4 monks entered together, each carrying a candle. They lit them simultaneously, chanting psalms in unison. Their voices echoed off the stone, filling the chamber with sound. The flames burned brightly, steady, for a single verse. And then, one after another, they died. Not all at once, not in chaos. Sequentially, from left to right, as if counted, as if chosen. The last flame lingered longest. It burned until the monk who held it began to shake, his arm trembling so violently the wax spilled down his sleeve. His brothers shouted, trying to steady him. But before they could reach, the flame went dark. He swore afterward that he had felt something brush against his hand, soft, cold, as if fingertips had slid across his skin. And then silence. The 4 of them stood there, holding blackened wicks, listening. Their breath was loud, harsh. The chamber gave nothing back. When they returned above, they tried to explain, but words failed them. They could only repeat the same phrase again and again. It did not want us there. From that night onward, the reliquary was guarded differently, no longer as a place of honor, but as something contained. A door kept locked, a chamber to be endured, not celebrated. And yet, their duty remained. Each night, monks descended. Each night, they tried again. And each night, the flames were extinguished. The repetition wore them down. Their faces grew hollow, their eyes sunken. They began to avoid one another's gaze, afraid of what they saw reflected there. Whispers spread, that the chamber was not merely silent, that it listened, that it drew close when the light appeared and recoiled only when it was gone. One monk, his name lost, broke his vow of silence and described the experience aloud during a meal. He said that in the instant the flame vanished, he could feel something standing inches from him, that if he reached out, his hand would brush against skin. No one answered him. No one corrected him, because they all knew. And still, the church insisted on duty. The reliquary was holy. The bones were sacred. The silence was obedience. But beneath, in the chamber, the monks kept their secret, that every candle was snuffed out, that every flame was pinched away, that the darkness was not empty. It was breathing, and the men who stood guard over it could no longer tell whether it was a chamber that feared the light or what rested inside. The cloister was quiet. The stones of the courtyard glistened faintly with dew. The bell of Compline had already sounded, and the monastery should have been asleep. But beneath the earth, in the chamber of the reliquary, light burned. Dozens of candles had been set on iron stands. Thick pillars of wax, thin tapers, lamps with wicks cut and trimmed. The abbot himself had ordered it, a night-long vigil, a challenge to the silence of the reliquary. He wanted proof. For weeks the monks had whispered about extinguished flames, about the suffocating air that stole their breath. Some had claimed they felt fingers against their skin. Others swore they had heard whispers curling out of the darkness. The abbot did not believe. Or perhaps he wanted to crush belief before it spread further. So he commanded a vigil, a night of uninterrupted prayer. 100 candles burning at once, he declared, would drive away doubt. But something wasn't right. The chamber was never meant for such light. The walls were low, The ceiling arched only slightly above their heads. When the first torches were lit, smoke gathered quickly, thickening in the damp air. Shadows multiplied across the stone, jagged and trembling. The monks sat in rows along the walls, their heads bowed, their voices low. They recited psalms in rhythm, a sound like waves rolling back and forth against the edges of the chamber. At the center, the reliquary sat. Its iron bands caught the candlelight, but only faintly. The wood beneath remained dark, as though it swallowed the glow before it reached the surface. One monk, Brother Peter, remembered staring at it for too long. He said later that no matter how many candles they lit, the reliquary remained indistinct. The light bent away from it. His eyes watered, his vision blurred. He forced himself to look down at the stone floor, and that's when he heard it, a sound beneath the chanting, a low groan, like timbers shifting under weight. He stopped singing, straining to listen, but no one else faltered. The voices carried on. The sound was gone. Hours passed. The air thickened with smoke. Wax dripped in steady streams down iron stands. The smell grew sharp, bitter, clinging to their throats. Some monks coughed into their sleeves. Others shifted uncomfortably, but none dared leave. The abbot stood near the reliquary, hands folded, face stern. His eyes never left the flames. Brother Julian wrote that the longer he stared, the stranger the flames appeared. Some bent sideways, as if tugged by invisible threads. Others flared and died without reason, leaving trails of smoke that curled into words he could not read. One candle guttered, then another, not extinguished by draft, not collapsed by melted wax, but snuffed. The abbot raised his voice, urging the brothers to pray louder. The psalms rose in pitch, trembling against the stone ceiling. The candles sputtered in reply. Brother Elias swore that he saw them go dark in patterns, not random, not scattered, one after another, like beads on a string being counted by unseen hands. Each flame waited, then vanished, waited, then vanished, and with each flame gone, the chamber seemed to shift. The walls looked closer, the shadows longer, the reliquary darker. Panic began to spread. The monks clutched their rosaries, whispered faster, their voices breaking into discord. The abbot tried to steady them, but even his voice wavered. By midnight, only a handful of candles still burned. Those who kept watch later remembered the silence between the chants, a silence filled with sound, a subtle scrape, like fingernails against stone, a faint rush, like lungs exhaling. But no one stopped praying, not until the last candle drowned in its own wax. And then nothing, darkness, a blackness so complete that the monks could not see their own hands before their faces. They sat frozen, listening to their own breathing, hearts hammered in their ears. Some tried to recall what happened then. Most could not. Their memories failed them. They remembered beginning the vigil. They remembered light filling the chamber. They remembered the smoke, the dripping wax, the slow death of each flame. But after nothing, blankness. When dawn came, the monks were discovered sprawled across the chamber floor. Dozens of bodies slumped in prayer, heads bowed against stone, robes damp with wax. The walls were blackened with soot. The air stank of smoke. Pools of hardened wax covered the ground like frozen rivers. Not one candle remained upright. The abbot himself was found at the foot of the reliquary, his hands blistered where he had tried to relight a wick with his own fingers. His lips were cracked, his face streaked with soot. When he was shaken awake, his eyes were wide, unblinking, and he could not remember. Not a single monk could recount the hours between midnight and dawn. Their minds were wiped clean. Their voices faltered when pressed for detail. Brother Severin, the first to speak, whispered only one thing. We prayed, and something prayed back. The abbot ordered silence. No record of failure was to be kept. The vigil had been holy, he insisted, a night of devotion, not fear. But the monks knew. They had lit dozens of candles, and by morning, not one flame had survived. What lingered instead was a memory missing, a void in their minds, a silence that was not absence, a silence that felt like presence. And for the rest of their lives, none of them would descend into the reliquary without trembling, because in that chamber, on that night, they had learned a truth that could not be written. Light could be forced upon it, Candles could be lit, prayers could be shouted, rituals could be performed, but the reliquary always won. And no man who entered its darkness ever truly left whole again. The camera drifts slowly into darkness. Stone walls breathe with a faint shimmer of dying flames. What remains of the light is thin and uneven, trembling across the uneven surfaces of an ancient chamber. It is here, in the hours when silence feels most absolute, that something new is recorded, not in official scripture, not in sermons, but in the margins of private journals. The monks who survived those vigils describe the same detail, that when the last of the wicks faltered and smoke rose into the stagnant air, they heard words, never louder than a whisper, never clearer than the crackle of ash, but always the same: return him. At first, they thought it was their imagination, the aftersound of chanting, or the confused echo of prayers spoken too long in darkness. Yet one by one, each man confessed that he had heard it, the same phrase, the same cadence: return him. It was not shouted, not demanded. It was offered like a plea, soft, measured, but with an urgency that seemed to reach from the stone itself. The smoke clung to their throats. It curled upward in ribbons, and though no one moved, each monk swore the haze seemed to carry shape, like breath being spoken. They grew afraid to remain alone in the reliquary. Men who had served their vows for decades began to tremble when the lamps were trimmed, not because of the dark, but because of what the dark seemed to carry. One journal, still preserved, describes it in plain words. We heard a voice upon the ash. We heard the command as though it were laid upon us. We heard it not with the ears, but within the marrow. Return him, return him, return him. But something wasn't right. When questioned, each monk believed he had heard it alone, that the others remained in ignorance, until they dared to compare what was spoken, and found the words identical. The abbot warned them not to repeat aloud, not to dwell upon it, and never to record it. Yet they did, because the whispers did not stop. By the third night, the smoke of the candles thickened the air so badly it stung their eyes. And through the sting, through the blur, they saw the shadows moving. Shadows that seemed to lean closer, like figures bending over a flame. And that's when he heard it. One monk, tasked with keeping vigil alone, fell to his knees when the voice came clearer. He swore the ash did not rise randomly. He swore it coiled into letters. Letters that spelled the same word: return. He wrote later that he tried to blink it away, that he tried to convince himself it was nothing more than tiredness, the hallucination of a man deprived of sleep. But as his candle gave its last breath, he swore the smoke curled toward him and pressed against his lips. He gagged, he coughed, and still the whisper came through his mouth as though borrowed: return him. By dawn, his hair had gone white at the edges, and his eyes no longer held focus. The abbot struck the candles from his hands and demanded silence. No more whispers, no more talk of voices. But silence did not bring peace, because in the days that followed, the monks began to speak of dreams. Not vivid, not elaborate, just the same impression, repeated endlessly: a stone door, a sealed chamber, and something waiting on the other side, always accompanied by the same voice: return him. The Abbey's records never acknowledge these events formally. They survive only in scraps. On the edges of parchment where script grows unsteady. On margins where ink thins into lines that shake. But even fragments carry weight, because in each, the detail is too consistent. The smoke carried words. The ash carried breath. And those who heard it never walked the same again. By the time new monks were sent to relieve them, many of the old guard could barely speak. Their voices rasped. Their lungs wheezed. They claimed they could feel the soot within their ribs. And worse still, each time they inhaled, they feared the voice would return with their breath. Not all of them lived to leave. Several collapsed in the chamber itself, their final moments choked with smoke. And though others tried to carry them out into clean air, their lips still moved, repeating the phrase, soft, fading, like smoke thinning in the sky: return him. No priest, no abbot, no confessor ever claimed to know what it meant. But the monks who survived carried the certainty that it was not metaphor, not vision, but command. And as the years passed, none could speak of those words without trembling, because each man who heard them was certain of one thing. The voice was not their own. The reliquary was not silent, and it would never again be silent until the command was fulfilled. Return him. The whisper lingers, the chamber breathes, and the walls are still waiting. The frame lingers on stone, cold, damp, weather-worn, a wall built centuries ago, its surface scored by hands that no longer live to remember it. Beyond the wall, a reliquary, silent, shut, and yet not forgotten, because outside its gates, the people gathered. It began with whispers in the villages that something still lived inside, that the saint's touch had not faded. Even after the candles were snuffed and the monks were sent away, they spoke of miracles. A lame boy who touched the outer stones and walked straighter. A blind woman who claimed to see light for the first time in years. A barren mother who swore her belly stirred after kneeling at the lock gate. But something wasn't right. Each of them returned changed. Not healed, not whole, but altered in ways they could not explain. The boy who walked straighter now woke screaming in the night, his legs convulsing as though trying to twist themselves back into the shape they once were. The woman who saw light no longer recognized her own children, mistaking them for strangers. And the mother, her belly swelled, but nothing within it ever moved again. The church took notice. At first, they dismissed the stories as peasant superstition, the desperate fancies of those too poor, too ill, too hungry to accept suffering without reaching for something beyond. But the crowds grew, and with them came unrest. Lines of men and women began to form at the gates of the reliquary, carrying offerings, scraps of cloth bread, even blood. They believed the saint was waiting. They believed the stone itself carried holiness. They believed their sickness could be answered, and so the doors were sealed, iron hammered across wood, locks drawn tight, guards stationed by decree of the bishop. No one was to enter, no one was to touch the stones again. But still they came. Mothers led children to the forest by night, pressing their small hands against the gate. Farmers laid tools at the threshold, praying for crops that would not rot in the soil. The dying dragged themselves to the fence, leaving stains of sweat and blood along the earth, convinced that one breath against the reliquary walls would carry them into grace. And that's when the change became undeniable. A pilgrim from the southern hills walked barefoot for 3 days, carrying nothing but a jar of oil. He poured it across the stones and prayed. Witnesses said he convulsed, his spine arched unnaturally, before collapsing into silence. By morning his body was stiff, but the oil had disappeared. Every drop absorbed into the stone. The villagers whispered that the saint had drunk it. The bishop sent word again. No more vigils, no more offerings. The reliquary was not a shrine, but a danger. Yet the orders did not stop the mothers. They were the last to obey, because for them, hope outweighed fear. And so at night, they laid their children at the gate, infants swaddled in linen, toddlers with hair combed, cheeks washed, eyes wide with confusion. They believed the saint's hand lingered, that if the monks could no longer pray, the children might be touched directly, that innocence itself would awaken mercy. But the children changed too. One mother, in a village only miles away, wrote of her daughter. She had left her there for only an hour, and when she returned, the child was still breathing, still warm, but silent. The girl would not cry, would not laugh, would not speak again. Her eyes stared into corners of the house where nothing moved, and each night she pressed her hand against the wall, tracing lines across the plaster, as though she could feel the stone of the reliquary beneath her skin. The mother begged the church to explain, but the priests only told her one thing, that the reliquary was forbidden, that nothing left there should ever be brought back. Still, she could not let her daughter go, and so she watched helpless as the child grew thin, her body wasting, her gaze fixed always on something no one else could see. Other children suffered the same. Some refused food, some wandered into the night and could not be found. Others sat silently for hours, lips moving with words no one could hear. By then the fear was too great to ignore. The reliquary was chained, the path to it overgrown on purpose, thorn and brush planted thick by the bishop's order. Guards were stationed again, this time with torches, instructed to drive away anyone who came near. But peasants still crept into the woods, still left their offerings, still pressed their children's hands against the gates when no one watched, because desperation is not reasoned with, and hope does not die easily. What the mothers believed was simple, that something holy lingered there, that the saints still listened, that to walk away was worse than death. But each journal that survived, each note smuggled from villager to priest, speaks with the same undertone, that what lingered inside was not blessing, that what touched them did not heal, that every soul who pressed against the gate left something behind, and in return, something else followed them home. The reliquary remained shut, the locks rusted, the guards were rotated, but the stories continued. Peasants with hollow eyes, children who would not speak, fields that yielded only ash when tilled. The people prayed, but their prayers turned toward the stones instead of heaven. They whispered of miracles, but each miracle carried the same ending, a change that could not be undone. And so the church faced its choice, to admit what was happening, or to seal it forever. The bishop chose silence, and for the peasants who remained outside, silence was not enough, because silence did not explain why their children's lips whispered words they had never been taught, why their bodies grew cold while their eyes remained fixed on unseen corners, why every mother who left her child at the gate knew, with a certainty that grew heavier by the night, that something inside had already claimed them. The reliquary was forbidden, but that did not mean it was empty, and those who gathered at its walls swore they felt it breathing still. The lantern light pools faintly against stone. A single figure moves downward, steps echoing against walls that have not heard voices in centuries. The passage is narrow. The walls close in. Each stone feels heavier than the one before, as if the earth itself is pressing against this hollow space. The air is heavy, not with dust alone, but with something deeper, something carried by the silence itself. The man is a Jesuit, a scholar, a servant of study, not of superstition. His permission had not been given lightly, for the reliquary had long since been sealed. Generations of abbots had sworn it would remain untouched, and yet the church allowed one exception, a descent for knowledge, a descent for record. At first, his notes are precise, measured. He writes of the architecture, the weight of the vault doors, the faint smell of ash that lingers though no fire has touched these walls in centuries. He observes. He does not speculate. But something wasn't right. By the second day, his script begins to change. The even lines of ink slope, pauses lengthen between his thoughts. He writes of candle stubs stacked along the reliquary floor as though left by hands long gone. But no pilgrim should have entered here. No flame should have burned. And that's when he heard it. Not a voice at first, just a faint hiss of wick as smoke curled upward. He describes the sound as breath caught in stone, a whisper without tongue or throat. Still, he dismissed it. He was a scholar, and scholars do not record shadows of the ear. But in the margins of his diary, words appear written smaller than the rest, letters pressed with trembling pressure, a line repeated, though unfinished. He is not at rest. The tone of his record shifts. Gone is the measured observation of an academic mind. In its place, hurried strokes, jagged ink, notes written by a hand unsteady. He writes of waking in the reliquary, though he does not recall lying down. He writes of wax melted across his robes, though he does not recall lighting candles. He writes of breath on the back of his neck, though he had sealed the vault from within. The scholar insists he was not dreaming, but the ink itself betrays him. On one page, a sentence halts mid-word. The nib had pressed through parchment, as though dragged suddenly by an unseen hand. For days he catalogued the remains. Fragments of bone, scraps of cloth said to have touched the martyr, ash sealed in glass. Each night, his notes grow more uneven, more frantic, until one page breaks pattern entirely. The entry is scrawled across the parchment at a slant, words nearly illegible. The language is neither prayer nor record, but an outpouring. He does not sleep. He has never slept. They buried him wrong. The ink stains deepen, as though the pen was forced against the page again and again. And at the bottom, in a hand no longer careful, he scratched 3 words. He is waiting. The diary fragments end there. No scholar's conclusion. No return to calm reasoning. Only candle stubs burned to the quick, wax fused into the parchment, and words carved as though with iron rather than ink. When the Jesuit failed to return, they broke the seal. His body was not found. Only the diary remained, and the stench of spent smoke that lingered long after the last page was turned. No one has been permitted to enter since. But those who handle the fragments say the margins tell more than the words themselves. Pressed into the edges of the pages are lines that were never written with ink, scratches deep as though gouged by fingernails. The marks form no language, no prayer, only repetition. Over and over, the same curve, the same jagged line, the shape of a mouth, and the diary closes there, a record unfinished, a witness silenced, but the words remain. He is not at rest. The reliquary was resealed, its key locked away, and the fragments of the diary were sent into archives where few dared to open them again. But fragments survive in whispered retellings, passages copied by hand, not official, not sanctioned, yet preserved. In those passages, his dissent becomes clearer. The first entries speak with the voice of a man of reason. He notes the ratio of stone to mortar, the geometry of the vault. He even measures the air, timing the guttering of flame to calculate oxygen. But as the days pass, precision gives way to unease. He begins to measure not just stone, but shadow. He calculates the echo of his steps. And then he records something else. A pause, a second set of echoes. Footfalls not his own. "But I am alone," he writes. The words are underlined, twice. Then again, until the page tears beneath the pen. From that point onward, the entries fracture. Sometimes they are lists of objects. Sometimes they are prayers written without meaning. Sometimes only single words, repeated until they no longer resemble words at all. He begins to write of the martyr himself. The bones, the ash, the body that was broken, then preserved. But he does not call it holy. He does not call it pure. Instead, he describes the bones as restless. He describes the ash as unsettled. He is not at rest, the diary repeats. The Jesuit scholar had been sent to study faith. Instead, he found disquiet. And in his final pages, the voice no longer sounds like his own. There are phrases that do not match his hand, lines that cut across his writing at strange angles, letters that do not belong to the language he knew. Some pages are written upside down. Others are written in the dark, words dragged by ink spilled rather than placed. On one, the letters appear burned into parchment itself. No ink, no pen, just a blackened scar. The word is the same. Waiting. Those who later examined the fragments remarked on the smell. Even centuries after the diary was sealed, the pages carried the acrid trace of smoke. Not old smoke, not faded, but as if the parchment had been singed only moments before. It clung to the fingers, it stained the air, and it lingered no matter how quickly the book was closed. The scholar had descended to study a martyr, but what he found was not martyrdom, not sanctity, not rest, only something unfinished, something unsettled, something that waited still. The descent of the Jesuit became a warning. No other scholar was permitted to enter. The reliquary was bound in iron, its doorway sealed not with stone alone but with chains. Yet still the diary survived, its fragments copied, its words retold, and each retelling carried the same refrain: he is not at rest. What began as study ended as obsession, and what was meant to be silence left only echoes. Echoes of steps, echoes of breath, echoes of words scratched in haste, trembling on the edge of reason. The camera drifts upward, almost weightless, through the hollow shell of a chapel blackened by soot. Light spills into fractured windows, catching the surfaces of stone scarred by fire. Shadows deepening in corners that no longer belong to prayer. Dust swirls like faint smoke, and on the floor in scattered heaps lie the remains of candle stubs burned long ago, their wax hardened into strange rivulets as if frozen mid-motion. It is said this was where they tried to defy the silence. The record comes from a final entry, copied in the hand of an unnamed monk, whose script quivers like someone writing while the body resists. It tells of an evening when faith tried to fight back, when they chose to bring light into the room that would no longer welcome it. They gathered 1,000 candles. They lined them in rows upon the altar, set them against the walls, filled niches where statues had once stood, crowded them into every corner where shadow had taken hold. Wax pillars both tall and short, some fresh, some scavenged from other shrines, all meant for one purpose: to overwhelm whatever lingered there, to prove that flame and prayer could still outnumber the darkness. But something wasn't right. The chronicler writes of hesitation, even as preparations were made. The monks, weary and pale from nights without rest, handled the candles with a kind of trembling reverence. One described it not as setting light, but as preparing bodies for burial. Another wept as he pressed a wick into the altar's edge, whispering that this was a provocation, not an offering. And yet they did it. When the hour came, the chapel filled with the dry rasp of matches. Sparks flared. Flame caught. One by one, the candles rose into life, until the hall was bathed in gold. For a moment, it must have been breathtaking. The ruined apse glowed like a furnace. Stone walls trembled with warmth they had not known in decades. The shadows, once so patient, retreated into corners where the light pressed too hard. 1,000 flames swayed together, and for a moment it seemed the darkness had been defeated. But then, the first candle went out. No draft, no breath, no hand, just silence. Then a faint wisp of smoke curling upward. The monks paused. Some whispered prayers louder, hands tightening over rosaries, eyes fixed on the walls. They lit again. The flame returned. But moments later, another extinguished. Then another. The chronicler writes that it was like watching a count. 1, then 2, 3, then 4. Each flame snuffed not at random, but in sequence, as if someone were walking among them. And that's when he heard it. A sound carried not through the air, but through the body itself. A rhythm, a breath too deliberate to be the wind. Almost like words, yet too faint to grasp. He swore he heard them count. The monks tried to relight the flames. Each time, the extinguished wick caught again, only to die moments later. Always in order, always in silence. The light dimmed, slowly, steadily, like sand running through an unseen glass. 5, 6, 7. The scriptorium notes grow frantic. The handwriting slants as if written mid-panic. He describes men breaking down in sobs as the chapel darkened. Others clutched their ears, insisting they could hear footsteps pacing through the rows. The air grew dense, thick with the smell of smoke that did not sting but suffocated. Still, the counting went on. 8, 9, 10. Until half the candles were gone, the chamber split in two, one side radiant, one swallowed by absence. The division ran clean down the center of the chapel like a wound. The monks begged to stop. They cried that this was no ritual of faith, but a summoning, that they were not offering light, but feeding something with the act of watching it consumed. But the leader, older, gone from sleepless nights, refused. He insisted they had to endure. That true devotion meant not retreating before trial. His voice broke even as he said it, but he stood fast, knuckles white as he gripped the altar. So they watched. One by one, the lights continued to fall, until only 10 remained. 10 fragile flames trembling in the cavernous dark, their glow too small to push back the edges. And then, 9, 8, 7. The record shakes with final desperation. Words scratched almost illegibly. It counts with us. It breathes with us. It waits. Until there was only one. A solitary candle at the altar's edge. Its flames stretched thin, quivering as if resisting, holding on against something unseen pressing close. The monk writes that every man in the room leaned forward, breath held, bodies rigid, watching it cling to life. And then it died. The last thread of light vanished into smoke. Darkness swallowed everything. For a moment there was silence. And then the bells. High above, in the ruined tower where no man stood, the bells began to ring. Not a single toll, not a chime of the hour, but a peal, deep rolling, sustained, swinging heavy in the night air as if gripped by unseen hands. The monks fled. Some collapsed on the floor, unable to move, hands over ears, screaming against a sound that seemed to come from inside their skulls. The chronicler writes that the bells were not ringing in harmony, but in words, that their peals formed syllables, that within the thunder, he heard the same phrase whispered on the smoke of dying wicks, "Return him," over and over, until his hand could no longer write. The diary ends mid-sentence. Wax smears the page, hardened as though spilled while he tried to relight the flame. The ink trails into a jagged line that bleeds off the parchment, stopping abruptly as if the hand that held it was seized. No one speaks of what happened after. No record tells of the monks who remained, or how long the bells tolled. Only that, when dawn rose, the chapel stood cold and silent. The candles were gone, the floor bare, not even wax remained. And yet, villagers swore they heard the bells echo across the valley for days afterward. Not a melody, not a call to prayer, but a sentence, low, repeated, never louder than a whisper carried on the smoke of memory. "Return him." And it never stopped. It never stopped. The camera moves slowly, through a long, narrow aisle of stone. Dust hangs in the air like mist. And at the far end, an iron door waits in silence. It looks ordinary at first, a door of hammered black metal. But step closer, and you see the weight of it, the layers of lock, chain, and wax, the smell of rustic in the air. This was no simple closure. It was a burial, not of a body, but of a secret. The year was 1731. Rome had grown uneasy with the stories of pilgrims who never came back, the whispers of bells ringing without hands, the memory of candles that died one by one. And so, by papal decree, the reliquary was to be shut forever. A team of clerics was dispatched, not to pray, not to venerate, but to lock, to bind, to silence. They came with hammers and chains, with wax and seals, and with the heavy presence of Rome's authority. The villagers watched, some in relief, some in terror, and a few in quiet, gnawing grief. Because even then, even as the locks clamped shut, mothers still came at night, leaving offerings at the gate, cloth bundles, bread loaves, once even a child. The church never admitted to that, but the locals remember. They still whisper it. They still tell the story. A mother who pressed her child against the door, believing the saint's hand would pass through the iron. The child was gone by morning, but the chains remained. The first lock was iron, a massive padlock, hand-forged, as wide as a man's palm. The second was a chain, wrapped across the door twice, then bolted into the wall. And then the seals, 7 seals, circles of red wax pressed flat against the doorframe, each stamped with the insignia of Rome, each promising authority, each promising silence. The priests who performed it wrote of the task, not in their official reports, but in their journals. One described the sound, the way the hinges creaked, not outward, but inward, as though something pressed from the other side. Another described the smell, not of damp, not of mold, but of burning, like charred cloth, faint but inescapable. And one, the youngest among them, described a moment he could not explain. As the final seal was pressed against the door, his candle flickered and went out. He relit it, hand shaking. But when he looked down, he swore the wick was not blackened, as if it had never burned at all. The reliquary was shut. The key was carried to Rome, and the villagers were told to forget. But they didn't forget. They couldn't, because the locks began to rust. Not after years, not after seasons, but within weeks. The first padlock, barely hammered into place, already streaked with orange decay. The chain turned brittle. The wax seals cracked and flaked, though no weather touched them. It was as if the door was breathing. One farmer said, metal corroded faster than it should, as though something inside pressed against it, not with force, but with time. And the villagers noticed something else. Each spring, when the air grew wet, the sound returned, the sound of iron shifting, the slow, dragging sound weight against hinges. At night, when no one was near, the door moved. Not open, not shut, just moved. And those who lived closest said they could hear more. Not bells this time, not voices, but something quieter, a ticking, as if nails scratched against stone. Counting, measuring, waiting. The church denied it. Officials dismissed the stories as village superstition. Rust, they said, was natural. Locks corroded, wax cracked, iron settled. There was nothing beneath it, but the villagers knew better. One mason, hired to repair the chains, spoke of the moment his hammer slipped and struck the door itself. It rang, not like metal, but like bone, hollow and deep, as if something vast was behind it. He refused to return, and he died weeks later. His neighbors said he could not sleep, that he spent nights staring at the fields, muttering, as if listening for something no one else could hear. The rust spread faster. Every year, the locks had to be replaced. Every year, the seals renewed. It became a ritual in itself, a ritual of suppression. Rome fought to contain not just a relic, but a memory. Still, the villagers persisted. On certain nights when the bells should have been silent, they swore the chains rattled, not from wind, not from storm, but from inside. And there was one more detail, a detail buried in the records. When the Vatican archivists inspected the key in 1742, they found it corroded, not by touch, not by weather, but by something that had eaten into the metal itself. The shape of the lock no longer matched. The archivists wrote of it in careful Latin. They speculated about poor smithing, about humidity, about natural causes. But the villagers already knew. The lock had not failed. It had been rejected, and the door was no longer listening. But something wasn't right, because in the winters that followed, those who walked too close to the reliquary door said they felt warmth. Not the warmth of sunlight, not the warmth of bodies, but the warmth of something breathing through stone. And one boy, a shepherd who grazed his flock nearby, swore he saw steam curling through the cracks of the seals. On a night when the frost lay heavy across the fields, he told his mother. His mother told the priest. The priest told no one. And that's when he heard it, the sound of metal snapping. Not outside, but inside, as if one of the chains had given way. He never spoke of it again, but he never went near the church after. The reliquary still stands. The chains were placed again and again, the seals pressed with trembling hands. But each year, the rust returns faster. Each year, the locks grow thinner. And though no one will admit it, the villagers still say the same thing, that the door is waiting, not be opened, but to open itself. And when it does, no chain, no wax, no seal from Rome will be enough. The reliquary door waits at the end of a narrow corridor. Stone walls lean in. Moisture beads along their surface like sweat on the skin of the earth. And in the dimness, there's a figure, a man hunched against the iron-plated door. His name was Matteo di San Angelo, the last appointed keeper, the final man sworn to guard the relics no one dared to touch. It was the year 1821, and by the time he was found, Matteo's body was already cooling on the stone floor. His hands were charred black to the bone, but there was no fire. For 2 centuries, keepers have been assigned to this post, a chain of men, each more reluctant than the last. They kept watch not to protect the treasure inside, but to ensure it never slipped beyond the lock. It was a role that passed like an inheritance, father to son, brother to brother, sometimes to a reluctant nephew with no one else to take the duty. But by the dawn of the 19th century, the chain was breaking. Fewer men volunteered, fewer families offered a son, and whispers filled the surrounding villages. The reliquary was cursed, and those who guarded it did not live long. Matteo was not the strongest candidate. He was frail. His health had always been uncertain, but he was devout, and the church demanded obedience. He obeyed. For months, he kept vigil by candlelight, alone in the corridor of stone, reading psalms aloud until his voice rasped and cracked. He marked time not by daylight, but by the slow burning of wax. One candle after another, their stubs collected in a copper dish beside the reliquary door. And each morning, when the bells rang for prime, Matteo emerged pale and shaking, his lips blackened by smoke, his eyes wide as though he had seen something in the darkness he could not tell. But something wasn't right. On the last night of his life, his routine broke. The other clergy noted he did not come to supper, nor did he ring the handbell to signal his prayers had ended. Hours passed, then silence, until one monk went searching with a lantern. He found Matteo collapsed against the reliquary door, his palms fused into blackened claws, the stench of charred flesh clinging to the air. And yet, the wood of the door was cold. The iron showed no heat. Not even the wax of the nearest candle had melted. The prayer book lay open beside him. Its pages were smeared with sweat. The ink had run with tears, and the whole volume smelled, not of fire, but of extinguished tallow, as though 100 candles had been snuffed out at once. Some believed Matteo had simply fallen victim to his own imagination, that his mind had fractured after months of solitude. But others, those who touched his hands, those who smelled the air still heavy with burnt flesh, they whispered something different, that he had reached out, that he had touched the lock of the reliquary, and something had touched him back. In the weeks that followed, Rome sent inspectors. Officials recorded his death in cautious words. Natural cause, cardiac weakness, an accident of the wax. But their own descriptions betray unease. They note the blackened skin. They note the absence of any flame. And they note the strange detail of the book. The scent of candles extinguished violently, though none had been lit in the chamber that night. And that's when they heard it, on the day Matteo was buried, when the coffin was lowered into the soil, a low ringing carried across the fields, the bells of the abbey tower. But the ropes were still. No hand had touched them. The reliquary has remained sealed since that day. Its lock rusts faster than iron should. Its wax sigils crumble, though they are renewed each year. And in the villages nearby, Matteo's name is still spoken. The last keeper, the one who died with his hands burned black, as though he had tried to hold shut a door that would no longer stay closed. Some say he was a final sacrifice, others the final warning. But all agree on one thing. No keeper has stood watch since. And when the candles are lit in the abbey, their flames gutter strangely, one after another, as though something in the dark still remembers the man who tried to guard it, and still waits. The ruins rise quietly from the hillside, stone walls fractured by ivy, windows choked with vines, archways that once echoed with psalms now open only to wind and silence. From a distance, it looks ordinary, a cloister abandoned like countless others, an empty relic of history. But when you step closer, the air changes. It is colder, still, as if the world holds its breath at the threshold. Tourists come despite the warnings, despite the fences erected by the state, despite the signs declaring collapse, danger, and fine for trespassing. They climb over rusted iron gates. They slip through gaps in hedges. They enter the ruined cloister with curiosity sharp in their chest. They come with cameras, with flashlights, with matches and lighters tucked in their pockets. And nearly all of them tell the same story. Nothing will stay lit. At first, they laugh. It feels like coincidence. A match scraping against the box, failing to spark. A lighter wheezing air, but no flame. But then another fails, and another, until their pockets are empty of matches, until their fingers are raw from flicking metal wheels, until silence grows around them like a second skin. Some say it's the damp, moisture trapped in stone, air too heavy for fire. But others notice the draft, a sudden movement of wind that should not exist within sealed walls. It comes from nowhere. It curls against the back of the neck. It bends a grass, lifts the dust, and extinguishes the flame in a single breath. And in that movement, a sound, not the rush of air, not the shift of stone, but a whisper, their own names, One tourist from Naples described it carefully. He had entered with 3 friends. They carried a lantern, the old kind, fueled with kerosene. They wanted photographs in the style of monks. The lantern lit easily outside the cloister walls. Its flame steady in the night air. But the moment they stepped into the cloister yard, the glass fogged with condensation. The flame thinned, and then it went black. No matter how many times they tried, it would not stay lit. And when the man knelt to adjust the wick, he heard it, a breath against his ear. Soft, close, shaping the syllables of his own name. He turned. No one stood behind him. His friends were across the yard, one kneeling, one fumbling with a pack of matches, another cursing at a dead lighter. None had spoken, and yet the sound was there, still circling his name like a chant. He left the cloister that night without his lantern. He refused to pick it up where it had fallen. Others have tried to debunk the stories. Historians point to damp stone and faulty lighters, skeptics to the power of suggestion, psychologists to the human mind's need to hear familiar sounds in chaos. But the stories multiply. Couples sneaking in with flashlights, only for batteries to drain within minutes. Hikers claiming their matches snapped in half before striking. One group describing a single candle that lit, only to gutter out, not in the motion of a breeze, but as if pinched between 2 fingers. And something else. Some of those who enter come back with burns, tiny round marks along the fingers, the kind you get if you held your hand too close to flame. But no flame had ever appeared. The ruins remain untouched. No restoration. No careful scaffolding or protective glass. The state listed as unstable, unworthy of tourist development. But the truth is different. Engineers will not stay inside. Their instruments fail. Their equipment shorts. Surveyors leave with blank notes. Architects abandon their sketches. And the locals, those who live closest, refuse to enter at all. One woman described what she saw from the road. She passed the ruins one evening after dusk. No tourists, no officials. The cloister was still, and yet she swore she saw light. A brief spark, like the flare of a match. Then nothing. Then again, a sudden glow, too fast, too violent, snuffed out before it grew. She said it looked as if someone was trapped inside, trying again and again to strike a flame, and failing. But something wasn't right. She said the sparks didn't rise. They didn't scatter upward as sparks should. They fell downward, straight into the earth. Today, the ruins are fenced, patrolled. The government explains it as safety, collapsed beams, unstable stone. But those who have lived long in the valley know better. They say the cloister is guarded not by locks or gates, but by the air itself, an air that will not allow fire to live, an air that erases the small comforts of light. And if you stand too long in that darkness, if you wait while your matches fail, if you listen to the wind gathering in the arches above, you will hear something, not once, not twice, but over and over, closer each time, the sound of your own name, whispered by a voice you cannot place, until it feels less like a warning and more like a summons. The cloister ruins remain untouched. The walls crumble, the vines grow deeper, but nothing burns. No match will spark, no lighter will catch, no candle will stay lit. And those who step inside, those who stay too long, never forget what the draft carried back to them, their own name, called from the dark and answered by no one they could see. The camera drifts slowly over stone, scarred by weather, cracked by centuries, and pale beneath the weight of forgotten time. The ruins of the cloister lie in silence. No banners, no hymns, only walls left collapse into themselves, and archways that open onto nothing but weeds. It is here the reliquary once stood, a place where pilgrims walk for days, clutching rosaries, whispering litanies, where candles once lined the corridors, burning in devotion. Now the corridors are only corridors of wind, and every flame has gone out. The records end quietly. No declaration from Rome, no testimony of witnesses, only the strange, sudden cessation of ritual. 1 year the reliquary was kept, The next, the doors were closed, the lock sealed, the silence begun. But something wasn't right. For centuries, the faithful believed the bones belonged to Saint Bartholomew, the martyr flayed for his testimony, the patron of courage and endurance. His relics had been honored across Europe. This shrine was thought to hold his final resting place. Yet the bones within were never publicly examined. No verification was made, and no candle would hold. When local priests attempted vigils inside the cloister, their candles guttered within minutes. Wax pooled down their fingers. Wicks drowned in their own tears. Even fresh tapers, carried in by travelers, went dark before their prayers were complete. They whispered among themselves. Some said it was dampness. Others said draft. But a few admitted something else. It was not that the candles blew out. It was that they died, as though the flame itself refused to linger. And that's when he heard it. One parish clerk, tasked with keeping the chapel in order during its last years, spoke of a sound. He described it not in sermons, but in a private letter. His writing trembled with ink blotches. He told of a whisper that rose whenever his taper began to fail. Not a voice he could name, not words he could repeat, only a hiss, as though the air itself leaned close to his ear, as though the darkness exhaled against him. No one believed him, but within months, his post was revoked, and within weeks, he was gone. The silence remained. Historians who study the cloister today still puzzle over the reliquary. Why was it locked so decisively? Why did papal seals forbid its opening? Why were its records buried in silence rather than canonized in triumph? There's a question that lingers. What if the reliquary was never meant to preserve sanctity, but to contain something else? If not Bartholomew's body, then whose? The bones within were spoken of only as the martyr. But the word martyr is not a name. It is a category, a shape into which any story may be forced. And the Church, faced with doubt, may choose silence over confession. No candle has spoken truth, because no candle has survived. Tourists who trespass near the ruins in the present day often report the same. They strike matches, but they do not catch. They light lighters, but the flame gutters as if choked. And when they carry lanterns, the glass fogs with condensation until the light suffocates. A group of students once dared each other to spend a night in the ruin. They came equipped with flashlights, batteries, and candles. By morning, they returned to the village pale, shaken, unwilling to explain. When pressed, they admitted their devices failed within minutes. Not only the flames, the batteries, too, their watches, even their phones, all drained, as though time itself rejected their presence. But something wasn't right. They claimed that as the last candle gave out, one of them, just one, heard his name spoken in the dark, not shouted, not called, whispered, low, personal, directly into his ear. He fled before the others, and he never went back. Scholars call it superstition. Locals call it warning. But the truth remains unsettled. If the reliquary did not hold Bartholomew, then who lay within? If the bones were holy, why would the Church silence them? And if the bones were not holy, what had the candles always tried to show? Silence is sometimes protection, sometimes erasure, sometimes complicity. And the silence of the flame has never lifted. For in the cloister ruins, there are no prayers spoken, there are no liturgies read, there are no vigils kept, and no candle will burn, because something waits there still, something nameless, something the Church did not sanctify, but sealed. And the silence, more than the darkness, is what survives, because silence does not die, not even when the flame does. The final reflection asks whether the reliquary preserves faith or conceals corruption. Was it sanctity or something darker imprisoned? Soft clothesline. Perhaps it was never a saint, but something that feeds on silence. The reliquary waits, and still no candle stays lit.